Well, good morning, one and all, and welcome to another Kepler Live. And today we have Jessie Smith with us. Welcome, Jessie.
Hi.
You can say hi. Oh, I think there you
Can
are.
you hear
Cool.
me?
I think there's actually a lag. Yes, but there's a little bit of a lag. So I'm gonna take you off and then bring you back on just a second. Okay.
How's it now?
Ooh, there's actually a little bit of a lag. How about I'll introduce you to everybody. But just I'm gonna kick you out of the stream and then just come back the same way you came in. That sound
Sounds
good? Okay, apologies for that, y'all. A little technical difficulty. But Jessie Smith is teaching Lost Tools of Writing, a Cersei curriculum, level 1 classical rhetoric this very fall. And she has a wonderful background as a homeschooling mom and classical education teacher that I'm eager to share with you guys. So she'll be back in here shortly. She lives in Louisiana, and there seems to be a hub of Kepler teachers in Louisiana. Hi, Jessie.
Hi.
That's great. Yeah, it's great. Sometimes the online platforms do us a disservice. So we'll put it on StreamYard instead of putting it on me. I'm sorry about that, and welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So I would actually love to start this stream by talking about you, who you are. You're a wife and a mother and an educator. And of course, with all of us, all the Kepler teachers, all those things in our lives going to integrate and come together. But it does seem, as I read your profile, like there's been a sort of an intimacy between all those things in your teaching career. So yeah, just tell us about yourself.
Okay, well, I began homeschooling when my youngest was in pre-K kindergarten. And as she got a little bit older, I was introduced to classical, and I just fell in love with classical. And I'm like, okay, what is classical education, and how can I teach my student classically? I was educated as my major at the time in college. Well, when I went to college, my major was elementary education. And then I switched, but I was educated in modern education. This is how you teach. This is the way. And so they're just a slight deviation from that. And so I just began looking for resources. What is classical? How can I learn more? And, this is just where I am now. We've hosted conferences, and I've had homeschooling communities, and all of those things have made me who I am today.
Yeah. So you say we've hosted conferences. Who's we?
So I guess it was about 4 or 5 years ago, my husband and I started a classical conference in Louisiana. And, I wasn't getting the answers that I wanted to get. And so how can I get these resources to people in Louisiana? I knew if I was having these questions, then other people were too. And so I would invite speakers. We've had Mr. Jim Nance come. We've had Heidi White, Dr. Perrin. And so, it was just really a blessing because we could have these conversations with these great classical educators. In live, we could ask them all the questions or just sit and listen to them have conversations. So we've been pretty invested, my husband and I.
Well, it's really interesting to see as homeschooling and alternative educations have evolved and gone forward in the United States, how different pockets emerge of people, popping up here or there and interested in this or that thing and seeking after God and raising their children. But, the resources and the knowledge, all of that is being shared better and better. But because of how all of it began to happen and emerge, it's, so common to hear, the stories of you start out isolated and on your own and kind of groping through things. And then as you build, you are able to have these conversations, and you need to pick at people's brains and kind of get from their experience.
Yes. I think that's important, or you stay stagnant.
Mm-hmm. Well, so what made you make that? And you talked about how you began as a young woman studying elementary education. Later on you became very interested in classical education, and you wanted to educate your kids classically. But what about classical education grabbed you so much?
I think what really grabbed me was that the students, the type of information the students were learning, the type of books that they were reading, it wasn't, they're hard. And I was interested in doing, they can do this. They can read these books. They can have these conversations. They can memorize a timeline. I mean, timeline actually was probably the first thing that sold me, is that, they can know this timeline of history. I don't even know a timeline of history. And so that's what initially grabbed me. And, as I looked ahead, my students were really young, but as I looked ahead to the high school years, it's like, these are the kinds of conversations that I want to have with my children. And, I'm going to do what I can to get there. Yes.
So, in your background, you have, time with the Scholé Group of families. That must be your group. I'd love to hear how those interactions were actually on the ground. Classical conversations. You use a blend of Charlotte Mason and classical things, I suppose, in your education methods. So I'd be actually very curious to hear how all those things have integrated for you over the years.
Okay. So I actually started out as a director for classical conversations. Again, I went to an information meeting and I said, I want this for my children. And in order to do this, I need to direct. I will bring the community in. I will do the marketing. I will do all of this. And we began with 4 students. And then the next year we had 16. And as that continued to grow, I changed different roles. I started managing, the broader community, several communities, as a support manager. And then as I began to change, as I had these conferences and these kinds of things, I decided, my husband and I actually decided that we want to bring these different things into our home, like reciting poetry and memorizing these kinds of stuff. And so my focus shifted. And so we've had a Scholé Group. Last year was our first year. And so we focused on, because they were younger, we focused on the Charlotte Mason. We focused on memorizing poetry. We focused on nature studies, handicrafts, all the read alouds, all these little things that maybe the moms don't have or feel like they have time to do at home. And so that kind of shifts the burden off of them if we can get it done in one day, and then they can teach whatever they want to at home, or build on that. So
very
that's
cool.
Just a blessing for us.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually, I think, such an integral part of the decisions that homeschooling families make. What works for us. But bearing in mind that support and community is such an important part of that experience. I'm Brazilian, and just yesterday I was doing a conversation live with a Brazilian homeschooling organization, and just seeing that the whole homeschooling movement in Brazil is kind of following a very similar trajectory as the American one did, but maybe 20 years behind. So the lack of resources, the lack of contact with other homeschoolers, but all that's starting to change as resources are coming in from other places. Brazilians are making their own. They're starting to communicate with each other. But it's so because of that, though, because I have contact with groups like that. That old hunger, like when I homeschooled in the 90s, that I experienced, that my parents experienced, you can see that, but it still is a part of the homeschooling life anywhere. And it's so easily to just kind of get caught into a routine of, you in your living room. And that's fine. But, when there's a homeschooling family a block over, when there's there are churches nearby that are hosting things for homeschoolers, when there are online education options, it's just so important to use all those tools, however your family thinks is best. But, we don't have to go it alone.
Yeah. And community is such a vital, it's so vital because, sometimes parents get kind of lonely and maybe even stir crazy, or they ask themselves, am I doing this right? And, other moms or dads can just say, hey, stick with it. You're doing well. We just need to be reminded that we're doing a good job.
Yeah. Actually, I think that's so important because that is a bugaboo for homeschoolers, that constant insecurity, and we so often we make decisions based on those insecurities, and if only we'd been able to talk to another mom, another dad who could have said, no, I've gone through the same thing, and someone else, settled me down. It really is. I think it's a vital part of homeschooling because you see those insecurities so often.
Yeah.
And sometimes they come from social pressures, but I'm glad that you do so much work to help diffuse that and to resource families, really. So let's talk about your class. Let's talk about Lost Tools of Writing, Classical Rhetoric. Introduce the class to us, please.
Okay, so our class is it's a class on how to write a persuasive essay. And what you start with is a thesis. Okay, should this character have done this action? And so you select a character in a book, and then you select an action that they did. And so, should they have done it? Should they not have done it? And so you pick a side. But before you pick that side, you start with that question. And then we do a chart. It's called an Annie chart. And so you have the affirmatives, they should have, negatives, they should not have, or the interesting. And so the students, they're having to put all these details in these columns. And then when they're done with the putting the information, coming up with inventing their invention stage, then they are going to choose a side. And so what this class does is they walk them through this process. What do I talk about? How do I arrange it, the information, and then how do I say it beautifully?
I love the term invention. It's probably one of so classical education does have a vocabulary of its own. Sometimes it can be easy to turn it into jargon, but but it's not. It is a useful vocabulary that really conveys some great messages. But I have to say, I have a special love for the use of invention in rhetoric, because it really just kind of conveys the way we use the word invention in English is such that it really conveys the active imagination in building your arguments and in building your narrative. Maybe talk a little bit about invention itself. Why is it important?
Well, it's important because I think a lot of times, a student might want to write about, should Aeneas have left Troy, right? Say that's your issue. Okay. And so your invention stage, you're going to ask yourself questions. Okay. Why was Aeneas leaving Troy? Now, there are actually 5 questions that the students can go to, because sometimes you're like, I've asked myself all the questions I can think about. And so your student will have these 5 common topics. And so it's comparison. So they're going to compare these 2 characters, in the book. They're going to define their terms. They're going to say, well, what was going on? Why did Aeneas leave? What was going on? And so, Aeneas left because he really wasn't supposed to stay there. Relation and testimony. What do other people say? What do the eyewitnesses say? And so during this stage of invention, your student will ask themselves questions, and then they're going to have so much more information to write their essay, they're going to be able to say, oh, I really do know a lot, and I have a lot of information here that I can pick from, and I can say either this side or this side of the issue.
Yeah. Well, I think it's great that there's a template, I suppose we could call it like that, because, one of the, teachers of any subject are constantly confronting the fact that students don't yet know how to handle how much they know, right? There's very often a very sincere blank look of, I really don't know the answer to that, but you as a teacher know that all the pieces are there. Right.
Yeah.
And so giving the tools to start integrating, and I think, that's as you move out of the logic phase, well into the rhetoric phase, that, you're learning how to do that. But that is something that needs to be taught, how to, within your own mind, integrate all the pieces that you've been picking up over the years.
Yeah. And as they go through this program, they're going to start thinking in a more logical way. And so they'll start making decisions. Should I do this? Oh, what are the pros? What are the cons? Should I go to this party? And, then you can have conversations with your children, and you both can follow the argument.
Yeah. So, when you put it that way, one of the things that is happening in a course like this is that you're helping to teach wisdom, right? The processes of wisdom, if you'll allow that phrase.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm curious this is a rhetoric course. There's it's essay writing. So I'd love to hear about rhetoric and writing as one thing, and then the importance of rhetoric in actual physical and verbal presentation. And do those interact in this course?
As far as the verbal presentation, not as much, but in the writing, it will be in that manner. You'll have to have your argument, and, at the end of the essay, they'll even say, well, some people say this, and then they'll have to give the strongest points of the other person's arguments. And, so that's at the end of the course. And then, it's just, I lost my train of thought.
Oh, we're talking about rhetoric and writing, and as they near the end of the course, they're having to deal with counter arguments and all of that.
Yeah, and it's a great, I think that's a great preparation for rhetoric when you're having this dialogue in person. I see your side now when you say it this way, but I disagree with you because of this.
Yeah. I'd like to take a moment to just plug to our viewers the summer courses that we have, and they're filling up. We do have some space left in 2 writing courses this summer, and writing is a great thing. To me, the 2 big things you can study in the summer are just natural summer fits are like book lists and reading, and then writing skills. And so, hey, I would absolutely recommend to Kepler families, take a writing class this summer term, and then sign up for the Lost Tools of Writing in the fall, and then you'll be inventing and arguing away. I absolutely love the thought of integrating that way. Now, Scott Postma asks a question: like invention, do all the rest of the canons of rhetoric apply to writing? What do you think?
Well, right now we're talking about invention and arrangement and elocution, and those definitely do. Now, you have the other ones, which are...
We have invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery.
Memory and delivery, yes. Memory and delivery we won't focus on in our course. Now,
that makes sense, yeah.
But as far as style, that's going to be the elocution. How do I say things in a way that is lovely? And, they're going to learn schemes, which are things that appeal to the ears, the reader's ears. And so these types of things are called parallelism, antithesis, alliteration and assonance. And so that's going to kind of delight the reader, and it'll make your paper flow. There are also tropes, and the tropes, those are going to be devices that appeal to the imagination. So you have metaphor and simile. And so those will be introduced in the elocution stage. And as far as the arrangement, we're going to jump back and talk about, like, okay, so how do I have these things that I want to talk about. Now, how do I arrange them where they make sense?
Yes.
Where the paper flows. I can't put my conclusion right after my thesis. It has to go in a certain order.
Right.
And so the Lost Tools of Writing, they introduce this all step by step, and it just is a really good program.
Yeah, when you talk about flow and arrangement, even there, we're talking about beauty. It's such an important aspect of rhetoric, that what you're trying to do is to present things not only correctly, not only convincingly, but beautifully. And in fact, it's not convincing to most human hearts if you present correctness in an ugly format. I'd go so far as to say you can't be correct if you're not being beautiful to some degree. You have to be handling the different sorts of arguments differently, and obviously a poem is going to be very different from an essay. But all truth and goodness needs to have beauty in it. So I love that. That's, even as you talk about a technical detail like where the conclusion goes, it's a question of winsomeness and beauty. Yes. So. Yeah. I see that you're meditating upon that, looking up at the heavens, and yes, I love it. So the course objectives are to learn to conquer 3 common challenges all writers face. I'd love to hear what those are. We talked about the 5 topics of invention, or actually we did not. And then the schemes and tropes you mentioned, but I'd love to hear about the 3 common challenges that all writers face.
Okay, so the 3 common challenges that all writers face is what to say, how to say it, and how to say it beautifully. Okay. So you have your invention, your arrangement, and your elocution stage.
Okay, yeah, so we did talk about it.
Yeah, we just said it differently.
That's great. So Scott wonders if you could talk specifically about why the Lost Tools of Writing were your choice. Is there anything about this approach that stands out from other classical approaches to writing?
Well, I specifically chose the Lost Tools of Writing because I just think it's a great program. Other writing programs, they don't necessarily talk about the 5 common topics of invention. They don't go into how do you write your essay in this manner. They kind of focus on, they might teach you simile, they might teach you metaphor, but they're not going to give you step-by-step how do you put it in there. And so I love that it teaches classical rhetoric. I love that it, every week you're walked through it in a logical manner. And then you're also reviewing the information as you're progressing through the course. So what you'd use in essay 1, everything builds. And so you'll definitely use it in essay 8. And so, Lost Tools has also taught me and my daughter to think in a more logical manner. We have some really great conversations, and, at times we'll catch ourselves having a conversation, and, we might have different sides of an issue. And, sometimes one of us will just stop and say, oh, you're right. I was wrong. And, it's not just a writing program, it's a thinking program.
That's very cool. So, the class is open for grades 7 through 12. Yes. So I'd be curious to know how the step-by-step aspect plays into that. How, as 7th grader or an 11th grader, how are they interacting with these steps?
Okay, well, seventh graders, they're probably going to need to take the course twice. Seventh and eighth graders are recommended to do that twice because they're probably just getting into the writing aspect. They should be able to write a paragraph. They should know the basic parts of speech. And so their essays may not look as polished as an older student's, but they're definitely still being required to do the same thing. A 12th grader may pick a better simile and a better metaphor, more fitting. But, writing's one of those things that you don't get better at writing unless you do it.
Right.
And, sometimes you even do it badly, and it's okay. Did you have a metaphor? Yes, you did have a metaphor. Then well done.
Okay. I can dig that. So one of the things in the texts that you guys are looking at that you mentioned is fairy tales. I'd love just to hear you talk about fairy tales and the importance of them in this program, the importance of them in classical education.
Yeah. So fairy tales, fables, and myths they're something that my children and I love. I did not grow up with fairy tales and myths, other than the Disney version. And as I've progressed and I've read aloud to my students, and we read fairy tales and myths from around the world, I'm like, oh my gosh, these are different. This is, Disney didn't come up with these. There are different versions. And, they're also a basis for some of the great books that we read. They're a basis for the gospel. Fairy tales and fables, you're going to see a clear good and evil. And that's what you get with the gospel. There's clear good and there's clear evil. There's truth. And so I also think that it opens up their imagination. When children are young, they have a wonderful imagination. And if reading fairy tales helps it thrive, it gives them good, I want to say meat to digest, good things to think on.
Yeah. It's funny how rich and mature, honestly, fairy tales are, and they do open up the imagination. But C.S. Lewis says somewhere, he talks about how as a child he delighted in fairy tales, but then he got to a point where he was embarrassed to appear childish, so he rejected them until he became an adult and was mature enough to like childish things and to want to be like a child, which is actually a biblical command. I think there's something that the childlike nature of but true nature of fairy tales, I think, is something that we as adults ought to be delighting in as well. But I am curious to know about your experience with 7th and 8th graders and fairy tales. I could easily see a high school senior being like, yeah, fairy tales are my jam. I love them. Kind of coming back through to that. But there must be an age where you have to convince them, maybe particularly the boys, that it's worth reading St. George and the Dragon or Little Red Riding Hood.
Yeah, I just have experience with my daughter and some of her friends. And at this point, they may pretend they don't like it. But, when I read them aloud to my other children, I'll find my daughter sneaking down, sitting at the table. And so, I really think they probably delight in them. They just don't want to admit it.
Yes, right. Because they are afraid of appearing childish. So they'll grow out of it. That's very cool. Actually, the live I did yesterday, the reason I had the Lewis quote on the tip of my tongue, the homeschooling live I did yesterday was on fairy tales. And I love fairy tales, and I love the idea of teachers incorporating them. So I'm glad you're one of the teachers who will be doing that. So Jessie Smith is offering the Lost Tools of Writing, Level 1 Classical Rhetoric this fall. It's a writing class. It's a rhetoric class. It's a thinking class. In talking to Jessie, we've seen that all of these things belong together. Y'all, if you're hanging out with us, do feel free to ask us some questions or drop in some comments as we approach the end of our stream. But I wonder, Jessie, if you could give us just a little sound bite, just a few lines where you kind of look directly at the families and tell them why they should take this class. Yeah, it's time for that sales pitch. You got this.
No pressure, right?
All right.
Well, if you want your student to think in a more logical manner, and you want your student to learn how to write a persuasive essay at the same time, then take the Lost Tools of Writing course. They're going to teach your student how to think. They're going to teach your student how to arrange their thoughts and how to write them persuasively.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And you why limit yourself to simply taking the Lost Tools of Writing when you could take the Lost Tools of Writing with Jessie Smith?
Yes.
Well, go ahead.
Do you see there's a comment?
Yes.
A question. Okay, so I will be posting the book list prior to class. I am currently working on that.
There you go. And then Daniel Fukushan comments, I think it was in a conversation with Andrew Kern that I asked, where should an adult get started on classical education? And his answer was Aesop's Fables. There are also fables specifically listed as being in your class. Fairy tales, myths, and fables are all very different things, but you are including fables in your class. Yes,
and Andrew Kern has so much wisdom. It seems like such a little answer, but yeah, Aesop's Fables, they have so much wisdom. I know Andrew was talking about Aesop's Fables, the grasshopper and the ants, and how the ants were, they were busy storing their grain during the summer and working, and the grasshopper was sitting there playing his fiddle. And then, in the fall, he was hungry, and he asked the ants for food, and the ants they kind of balked at him and said, well, what were you doing? And he said, well, I was making music. And, Andrew Kern, he just asked the question, well, should we take care of our musicians? And that's not traditionally how you read that fable.
You're absolutely right. That's not the normal way.
No, you think, okay, well, you played and we worked, so we get to eat and you don't. But the grasshopper he was making music. We need that beauty.
Huh. Wow. Yeah, I've actually, that is a thought I thoroughly agree with. Never approached that thought from that particular angle. Absolutely love it. There's that particular fable always reminds me of was it The Music Machine? No, Ansylvania. My mom bought me an album called Ansylvania when I was like 5 or 6 years old. I was full of fables like that, but one of them was there are all these ants, and they're very preoccupied, of course, with working and getting everything done on time. And the line, if you want a long vacation without making preparation for the coming winter when you go, and then it just goes into this whole thing. Anyway, the music of that particular story really has always stuck with me. And I just love how all these things just kind of bounce in together and integrate with each other. But it's particularly refreshing when there's something like what you just mentioned, Andrew Kern saying, and you have this fresh angle on something that was, it's just kind of been in the background of your mind, but you never looked at it from that way. Well, I really appreciate you being here and telling us about this course. And we're excited for the fall. We're excited for this class for you. Thanks everybody who's been watching and interacting with us. And Jessie, thanks again.
Thank you.